With that in mind, we're looking in Mark's Gospel, chapter 8. Seeing is believing, or believing is seeing. I guess we probably all heard that Missouri is known as the Show Me State. Right, Jerry? Having grown up there. Several in this room, I suppose, come from Missouri, but it's called the Show Me State, and maybe you didn't know why it got to be called that. But a Missouri congressman coined the phrase back in a speech in 1899. And this is what he said. I come from a state that raises corn and cotton and cockleburs and Democrats, and frothy eloquence neither convinces nor satisfies me. I am from Missouri. You've got to show me. That's why it got that name. As I'm thinking of people from Missouri needing to be shown, I kind of wonder if Jesus' disciple, so-called Doubting Thomas, didn't come from Missouri. Yep, you know what he said in John chapter 20, verse 25. He was a doubter because he said, unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger in the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And so he's a show me kind of a guy. If I can see it, I'll believe it. You know how the story goes. Some days after he made that statement, Jesus shows up and basically says, I dare you. Here I am. Go ahead. Touch my hands. Touch my side. I want you to believe. And so indeed he came to faith. And in John 20, verse 29, Jesus said back to him, because you have seen me, you believed? Blessed are they who do not see and yet believe. Seeing is believing in the case of Thomas, but Jesus says, blessed are those who believe and then they see as a result of that. Seeing is believing. Believing is also seeing. With that in mind, I want us to take a good look at these stories that we look at this morning in Mark chapter 8, because they are there for a reason. To lead us to be able to see and to believe, to lead us to be able to believe so that we will also see. And so that's what's behind what we're going to look at today. I so appreciate the theme verses in John's Gospel. Before we get into these verses in Mark 8, John's Gospel purpose is stated in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. It says, therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. That's the theme purpose for John's Gospel, but I believe it applies to all four Gospels. Everything that we read about the life of Christ, everything listed about Him is for an exclusive purpose, so that we might come to believe and see that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and not just come to understand that, but that by believing that we might really see eternal life in our lives. That's the great purpose in all the earthly ministry of Christ, is that we would see and believe and see, and fully experience the life that God has for us through His Son. So I want you to notice the first 9 verses, Mark chapter 8. In those days, when there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called His disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come a great distance. And His disciples answered Him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And He was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And He directed the people to sit down on the ground. And taking the 7 loaves, He gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to His disciples to serve to them, and they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish. And after he had blessed them, he ordered them to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 7 large basketfuls of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. The Gospels record 2 accounts where Jesus fed large multitudes of people. We're probably more familiar with the other one, a couple chapters earlier, the feeding of the 5,000. But this is a second great miracle, very, very similar to that. Now, I'm thinking as I read this account about the disciples having trouble believing that Jesus could feed all of those people, having been present earlier when he had done something so very, very similar. I have to wonder why it was that they would have trouble believing. They had seen him do it once. It seems like it would have been easy enough to have believed it could happen again. But verse 4, they're asking the same question on this occasion that they had asked before. Where will anyone be able to find enough bread in this desolate place? No supermarkets around, apparently. Where are we going to find enough bread to feed these people? They had asked almost exactly the same question when the first miracle took place. And so I'm wondering, well, why aren't they catching on and figuring out that he did it once, he's able to do it again? I want you to jump down now. Verses 14 to 21. This is after the great miracle had taken place, and it says they had gotten into a boat. Jesus ordered them into a boat in the earlier verses. In verse 14, it says they had forgotten to take bread and did not have any more than 1 loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, "Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." They began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of broken pieces you picked up?" And they said to him, 12. "When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large basketful of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you not yet understand?" I'm a bit slow at catching on to things. I'm not the sharpest tack in the box by any means. I'm kind of slow to catch on to things, but I would like to give myself more credit than the disciples. I would like to think that if I was there, I would have figured this thing out a lot earlier. Here it is. They've witnessed the 2 great miracles. Now they're in a boat. This is the part that really drives it home for me. Now they've gotten in a boat. Apparently they brought 1 loaf of bread. And now they're saying, we don't have enough to eat. In the boat is the one person who had performed that miracle twice and fed thousands of people. They're in the boat with the one person who did that, and we don't have enough bread. Again, I'd like to think that I could have caught on a lot faster than they caught on. And so here they are, absurd as it sounds. They're obsessed with the fact they didn't pack a lunch, and here with them is the one who made lunch for thousands. So in rapid fire order, Jesus peppers them with some questions. Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? He's trying to get faith out of them. He's trying to get sight and insight out of these disciples who are so very, very slow to catch on. And those are important questions. Those are questions that kind of ring on down to us today, because in that process of seeing and believing and seeing, those are things that every one of us need to consider as well. Those are questions that help develop faith in our lives. And again, I'm thinking that's why the gospel accounts of not only the story we've just looked at here this morning, but all the mighty miracles of Jesus are so very, very important, so that we can begin to see with eyes of faith the possibilities available to us through Jesus. I think that's what He wanted them to learn. Do you not see what I can do and accomplish in your lives? And so I think that comes down to us as well. Do you not see what I can do in your life? He wants us to open wide our eyes to faith possibilities. That's why I think it's so exciting to study the Gospels, to preach and teach from the Gospels, is because they expand the horizon of faith for all of us. I mean, isn't that where it gets exciting? Imagine what Jesus can do today in the lives of believers. That's why the time of study here this morning is important. That's why focusing on these Gospel accounts are so very, very important. Imagine what He can do in your life and mine today when you consider what He did then as recorded in the Gospels. So He asked the disciples those questions, and among the questions He's asking is, how many basketfuls of bread were picked up after the two great miracles? How about that first one, guys? Remember the 5,000 or so? That was just counting the men, not the women and children, so a lot more than that. Remember that first miracle? How many baskets did you pick up? They knew the answer. Well, there were 12. 12. What's the big deal with 12? Why not 11? Why not 13? He's trying to get them to understand there is some significance to that number. Why 12? Well, we understand there were 12 of them, right? 12 apostles. He had selected 12 apostles, and that was no coincidence. 12 is a very significant number in terms of the people of God. The nation of Israel has 12 tribes. And so no doubt He's trying to say something for each of you and for all of the people of God. There's plenty of provision for all of God's people. That's the deal with 12. And He said, what about the most recent miracle? How many baskets did you pick up after that? They right away answered 7. Again, what's the big deal with 7? Why not 5 or 6? Why 7? We understand that biblically 7 is a very important number. It is the number of completion. It is the number of God. When God does something, the number 7 is associated with it. Go back to Genesis, the creation account. How many days? 7 days. He rested on the 7th day. Go to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, a series of plagues and judgments poured out before the end of the age, and the number 7 is very, very prominent. And so when Jesus asked them about how many baskets, and they said 7, do you not see that God's hand is upon me and what I've been doing? And so there's the power of God to be seen in the things that are taking place here. And so there's some lessons in the numerology here that you ought to be seeing my Father's hand in the things that are being done through me. And then again the question, do you not yet understand? Fellas, don't you get it? Don't you see what this is all about? Again, He's trying to teach them some important lessons. And I believe that He's trying to teach us some great lessons as well. Again, as I think of this story in particular that we've looked at, the feeding of the 4,000, there's some lessons that come out of this down to each of us. Important lessons to learn. Number 1, faith is beginning with what we already have in our hands. I think that's one of the great lessons. Faith begins with what we already have in our hands. In both of these great miracles of the feeding of the multitudes, He asked the question, the exact same question, how many loaves do you have? What do you have available right now? What's in your hands right now? 5 loaves on the one hand, and then the other one there were 7 loaves. And it almost seemed like an absurd amount in the face of hungry crowds of over 5,000 and over 4,000. And thinking about whatever it is that's in our hands, there's a principle here. Whatever it is that we have in our hands will always seem woefully inadequate in light of the needs that are around us. So if we stop and ask that question, what's in my hand right now? Whatever it is, it will seem like nowhere near enough in terms of the needs that are around us. Whether it is our time or the resources that we have available, they seem like not nearly enough. And so in a very badly broken and hurting world, what we have cannot possibly be anywhere near enough for the needs that are out there, whether, again, individually or us as a church, whatever resources we have as a church. When we think about a world out there that's so badly broken and hurting, and whatever it is that we have to offer, it's just about like the 5 loaves or the 7 loaves with thousands and thousands of hungry people. It won't seem like enough, but that leads to, I believe, the second great lesson out of this passage. Through faith, the supply will always equal the demand. That's what faith does, is it allows the supply to equal the demand that is there. Verse 6 talks about the fact that Jesus took those meager loaves that were handed to him, and it says that he broke them. Well, I think he broke them. It's sort of like on Communion Sunday. We break the bread, but that's really not adequate for what Jesus did on that occasion. In the original Greek language, it says that he kept on breaking them. And so we might, on the one hand, imagine on that great miracle that what Jesus was doing was he broke the bread and just sort of piled it all up. And when there was a big enough pile, okay, guys, now you can take it out. That doesn't seem to be the case at all. What he was really doing was breaking it and distributing it and breaking it even more. And so it's sort of an unfolding miracle, if you can kind of picture that in your minds. It's important to clarify that and understand that, because when we go forward with what is in our hands, that allows him to do the miraculous work of multiplying our resources. And that's what faith calls us to see and to do. What we have in our hands, placed in his hands, goes out and meets the needs in ways that we could not imagine. That leads to a third very important lesson out of this passage, and that is that his resources are always sufficient. I'm thinking it would have been one amazing miracle in both of those occasions if all those thousands of people were fed and that was that. But it's like we had to go way beyond that. Not only were they fed from those meager loaves and fishes, but they collected all those baskets afterwards. As if to say, my resources are not just enough to meet the needs. My resources are so vast, there's an abundance beyond that. And I think that principle applies in our lives and how faith works with us, with what Jesus does. Again, the power of God at work in his life, that we might say like the Apostle Paul said, Ephesians 3:20, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think. Those are the resources available through faith, to be able to see that God's resources through Christ are that way. I want us to step back. I want us to really think about those 3 great lessons for a bit here this morning. Again, going back to the first one, that faith calls us to begin with what we already have in our hands. Let's linger on that for just a little bit. What has God placed in our hands? Thinking back in the Old Testament, God asked Moses the question, what is in your hand? Exodus chapter 4, verse 2. If you know the story, what was in Moses' hand wasn't anything terribly spectacular. It was a walking stick, a staff. What is that in your hand? God said to Moses, throw it down. And so he threw it down, and you know the story goes that it was turned into a serpent. It was a demonstration of the power of God. But God wanted Moses to take that ordinary thing that was in his hand and turn it over so that it might be used to display the power of God. Again, the principle comes down to us today. What's in your hand? What is it that's been placed in your hand? And God and his Son want us to turn that over so that something can be done with it. So we want to pause and think a bit about that. What is in my hand right now? Do I have some talents and abilities? Sure, every one of us do. So what about the talents and abilities? They may not seem like much at all, but there's talents and abilities in my life. How about time and availability? You might say, well, I don't have that much time. I'm a busy person. I got a full-time job raising the kids, whatever. I don't have a lot of time. Well, yeah, you do have some time and availability. And then we get down to financial resources. Well, okay, I got some money, but I don't have that much. Whatever the case, what is it that's in my hand right now? Again, it's not much compared to the needs around us and the great cause of the kingdom of God. It might seem embarrassingly inadequate, but again, that takes us to a second great principle and lesson here, that faith shows us that the supply will always equal the demand. Between these two miracles, the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, well over 10,000 people were miraculously fed by a little bit of bread and fish. But you know, looking beyond that, kind of zooming out from those two stories, fact is there had to have been a lot of hungry people in Israel besides those crowds at that time. But at the very center of where Jesus was operating, the supply indeed met the demand. I think there's a principle in that. I was thinking about an example in our own local church about how the supply equals the demand. Our internet outreach ministry, something we've been involved with for about 10 years. And I've been thinking about how God has allowed the supply to meet the demand with that. Remember, we started out with some very inadequate resources when we decided to step out in that area. And I remember a few years into it, out of the blue, somebody wanted to donate a camera to the ministry here. I thought that was just a phenomenal thing. Somebody who had been watching our rather meager efforts said, I want to give a camera. And so our ministry received a camera. As time went on, more resources came so that we've been able to increase what we were doing. And I just was thinking that recently, in fact, we're in motion with that right now, a significant gift was given that allows us to really be able to take a much further step forward. Again, that's in process even right now. But I was thinking it's a little bit like the loaves that were multiplied as they went out. Started out with some meager resources. It was an important work that we were involved in, that we are involved in, and the Lord has allowed it to increase in increasing measure as we've been going out with it. That's exactly the way the Lord chooses to do things. Faith reveals that His resources are always sufficient. We've all heard the saying, you can't outgive God, and you really cannot. It is true. Whatever it is that we place in God's hands and in the hands of His Son will increase beyond measure, because that's the way they do things. Luke's Gospel, chapter 6, verse 38 says, "Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over." I think that's the testimony of many of us in this room. Whatever I have given to the Lord, He has increased far beyond. His resources are well above what I have given. I was thinking that I've known some wealthy Christian people in my time, and some of whom are in this room, but there is a common factor with wealthy Christian people. Namely, they are generous. Knowing that God has been generous to them, they are generous, and God also continues to be generous in return. And so the more they give, the more that they get, and He's given far more than they have ever given away. Like the loaves and the fishes, there is abundance left over when the resources are given to the Master. In my own life, my own testimony is certainly that I am not materially wealthy or rich, but my testimony is that He has increased all that I have ever placed in His hands. And I think that my own life is a little bit like those loaves and fishes. That little meager life that I have to offer, I've offered to Him. I remember that I gave my life to Him when I was a teenager. And I knew my life wasn't that much, but I thought, this I want to give to Him. I knew my Master loved me, and I wanted to return that love and give Him my life. And so I offered my life over to Him for Him to use it in any way that He saw fit, in service and in ministry. I know that I will forever be amazed at what He's done in my life. The places that He has sent me to, the people that I've been blessed to meet, very high on that list are all of you in this room, and how He has multiplied my life in ways that I could never have possibly imagined otherwise. Not going to pretend to say it's always been easy, but I have no regrets because I've offered my life over to Him and allowed Him to do with my life as He's done with the loaves and the fishes. Sharing all those things, I know there's a lot of people that won't get what we've talked about here today, these great principles. Not everybody will see in order that they would believe. Not everybody believes in order that they would see. But I believe we have a room full of people here who do get it and who can testify to the things that I've sought to testify concerning Scripture. And I believe that if our sight and our faith have increased even just ever so slightly because of what we have considered today, then I believe that our time has been productive, and I believe it's been Spirit-led.